All right, so I've got some basic setup here with the P5 Play library. Um, since we left off in the last video, I've just gone ahead and separated out the sprite images that I'm using in this sketch. That way, if I want to edit them or mess with them later, I don't have to go searching through all of those subfolders in the zip file that I downloaded from OpenGameArt. So let's go back to our sketch, and what I'd like to do here is get some sort of interaction set up so that I can move the giant orange brain around on the screen. And then later on, I'm thinking that I'd like to add some obstacles that will prevent it from moving in the way that the viewer would want. And so rather than sort of just directly tracking the mouse or the touch point, what I'd like is more of sort of like a swiping action. So I'm imagining this being played on a touch screen, and I'd like to be able to sort of like swipe it and have the object sort of have some momentum and keep moving after it's not being touched anymore. So the first thing I'm going to do to try to figure out how to do that is look back at the P5 Play reference, and I'm probably thinking this is going to be somewhere in the sprite documentation. So I can see some methods here. I have a set speed and I have a set velocity. Let's look at the set velocity. So we have this method called set velocity. That might be promising in terms of what we'd like to get to happen here. We could also do this set speed. So this sets the speed and the direction. Overwrites the current velocity. If direction is not supplied, the current direction is maintained. If direction is not supplied and there is no current velocity, the current rotation angle is used for the direction. All right, so we've got a couple different options here. What I think, because it sounds a little bit simpler, I want to try to use the set velocity. And I'll imagine getting a vector between where the user starts to touch, then they'll move their finger, and where they let go. So I'm going to focus on the event functions for touch started and touch ended, and see if I can get that to create a vector that would then, maybe I would scale it down and get this thing to move. So I'm going to make myself a variable here called playerVec. So that's going to store the motion vector that I'd like to use to move this giant orange brain around. And I still don't know exactly how I'm going to implement this. That's okay. I know that it's probably going to have to do with the touch started and touch ended functions. And so what I'm thinking here is to record the location of the touch when it's started, record the location of the touch when it's ended, get the distance and the direction between those 2 points, and use that as a motion vector to apply to the giant orange brain. So, imagine I could start the touch here, click and drag, or swipe on a touch screen and let go over here, and that would cause the giant orange brain to move from left to right with a certain amount of speed. So that might be another thing I might need to take into account, is how quickly I would want that to happen. So I'm going to keep plugging with this approach and kind of see where it goes. Luckily, because I looked in the documentation, I know I have 2 different strategies I could use, set speed or set velocity. So I'm thinking that I'm also going to need a couple variables to keep track of where a swipe is starting and ending. And so I'm just adding in some syntax to store the location of the touch when it's beginning and when it's ending. And then we can compare those 2 locations to figure out the vector that will feed into our player object. And as I'm going here, I'm trying to keep up the habit of writing some comments for myself so that I can remember what it is I'm trying to do. So, again, I have a general idea here of what I'm going for. I don't know off the top of my head what the right functions are to deal with this sort of vector information in P5. So let's dig up the reference. And this is probably going to be under math. And I can see here I have some vector functionality. Great, so it looks like I could use this create vector function here. Oh, and I get a nice little example here. That's nice. So let's go back to our code. So I'm going to use that player vec variable to store the vector that's formed between where the touches started and where the touches ended. And basically what I need to figure out here is the horizontal distance and the vertical distance between both of those points. So I'm going to say touch end dot x minus touch start dot x, and then same thing for y. So that's going to give us our vector, and then we can reference our player object because we've already stored that in a variable. And I just want to jump back to my reference here, so I'm doing set velocity on that object. And I will call the .x and .y properties of that player vec. And I can't tell if this is giving me an error or not. Aha, here we go. Okay, so I think we just, rather than calling .x, let's call 0. Let's see. So for some reason, P5's complaining about this part of the code. I think that might be because these won't be defined by default until we get a touch on the screen. So let's see if we can initialize So let's see if we can initialize both of those touch points just with some default values. And I think that should be good. Aha. So that's still causing us some issues. Oh, let's go back into the P5 reference. I want to make sure that I'm understanding this touches array correctly. And I think that's under events. Here we go, touches. Okay, so yeah, so it should have X and Y properties. Let's go back. And I think what might make sense is to move this part of the code out of the draw block and into the touch ended block, because really we only want that calculation to run when a touch is ended. That's also going to make sure that there will be something in these touch variables. One thing I've noticed is that A lot of times, if there are no touches on the screen currently and you're trying to reference any sort of that information that's stored in the touches array, you won't be able to do that outside of one of these event functions without extra code that would sort of be checking for whether or not there's something in that touches array. So, and I think what's happening here is I need to do some different initializations with the touch start, touch end, and player vector variables, just so that they have some starting values that make sense and that allow that math to work before we actually start touching the screen. So I'm going to do that in setup. And basically just making these all empty vectors. And then let's get rid of those initializations. Cool, I think we're in much better shape here. But this is still causing some problems. So I want to see if I can bring up this sketch on my smartphone and duplicate this error, or see if that, if that fixes it, that kind of solves the problem for me. So in the next video, we will get our screencast set up and try to run this on the phone.